In so many ways, the town Black History Month is American History Month. Because American history and the Black experience are inextricable. And both are inextricable from policing. Far more often than not, it's been a good thing. Many of the best parts of America's history would have been impossible without the police. But sometimes the relationship has not been so good. And refusing to acknowledge it would not only be naive, it would be reckless and irresponsible. Because many of the worst parts of Black history would have been impossible without police too. Slavery, our country's original sin, sat on a foundation codified by laws and enforced by police, by slave catchers. Since then, the stories of police and Black citizens have been twined again and again. And the unequal nature of that relationship cannot and must not be denied.
Commissioner Bratton explained why Black History Month is an important learning opportunity for American police.
There's another reason why Black History Month is so important. Because if we as cops or as a society don't want to fall into inaccurate stereotypes, we need to teach ourselves about slavery, about Reconstruction, about Jim Crow in Rosewood, in Tulsa's Black Wall Street. We need to know about unequal access to VA home loans in the GI Bill after World War II. We need to remember blockbusting and backlash as busing and the whole Black experience.
Joining me now, Dorian Warren, host of Nerding Out on Shift by MSNBC and professor at Columbia University. Mark Thompson, host of Sirius XM Satellite Radio's Make It Plain, and of course Joy Reid, host of The Reid Report. Joy, your reaction to what Bill Bratton had to say?
Well, you know, it's interesting, and it comes very shortly after James Comey, the FBI director, gave a speech. It was very similar, and I was struck by the fact that I think what he really got right, and what Bratton did that I think was smart, was to say we can't just give a pass to history, which too often is what a lot of Americans want. They just want a blanket pass, and they want everyone to move on. But for the African-American community, the past is present, because a lot of the bad relations with police are not something that happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It's something that happened last week to their son, to their nephew, to themselves. So I think it was very smart that he did it. But I do think it's interesting how differently those kinds of words are received when a white Bill Bratton, or white Mr. Bratton, or a white Mr. Comey say it, or when a Black Attorney General say it. It's received extremely differently, and I find that fascinating.
Well, and Mark Thompson, nowhere in the history of American law enforcement has this kind of sensitivity been expressed before. I mean, that's what, I mean, a couple of small police chiefs here and there around the country with progressive attitudes have said things like this. But to begin the story of what today's American police officers need to know about policing, to begin that with slavery, that is not something police officers want to hear generally.
It's also different when a Black talk show host says it, because we talk about that history a lot. We know that history. It is startling for a big city police commissioner to acknowledge that the history of police in America began with slave catching. And then he also, in the speech, acknowledged the role of slavery in his very city. Wall Street was a slave trading port. That's why it's called Wall Street. That happened as well. So that was really an incredible thing for him to say. But he still later on in the speech spoke about some of the shortcomings of policing. I think this is a beginning, though. When I was in D.C., I taught a class at the D.C. Police Academy called The Historical Relationship Between African Americans and Law Enforcement. And the purpose of it was...
In that course, where did you begin?
With slavery. Yeah. Began right there. And the purpose of it, as he did allude to, police should have regard and be knowledgeable of the culture of the communities they serve. And so it was about respecting that history, understanding that history. One of the things we taught in the course was, you know, nowadays when we think about the term riot, the connotation is riots of civilians or even African Americans. But back in the early 1900s, a riot many times actually meant the police. It was police that were rioting against African Americans. You could almost say what we've seen in the past year with all of the police violence, cumulatively, not all at once, but cumulatively looks like a riot. So this was very important for him to say. I hope people will embrace it. But later in the speech, and we can get into it later, I think there's some other things that he said that still speak to a systemic problem within policing.
Dorian Warren, one of the values of this kind of speech from him is that he is listened to by people who will never listen to Mark's radio show, who will never listen to won't listen to anything Eric Holder says. They don't think Eric Holder will ever say anything worth listening to. He is listened to by people who think everything he said in that speech is wrong.
And let's hope that the people listening to him were his own rank-and-file officers, who will actually, whatever reforms come about, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, will actually listen to him and implement those reforms. It's important to note, Lawrence, we wouldn't have seen him give this speech, or the FBI director, if not for the protests.
That's right.
Over several months, the organizing by the activists involved with Black Lives Matter, this would not have happened. That was a crisis created through organizing and protest that forced him and a range of other elected officials and leaders, especially law enforcement leaders, to have to address these issues. It's remarkable, as Joy and the radio host, Doctor, says, for him to talk about black history and to start with slavery. That was remarkable. Yeah. There are other parts of the speech where he gets history wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I think it is absolutely a speech that would not have been given without the events of Ferguson. And let's listen to what he said about Ferguson and those issues in that speech.
Police actions can still be a flashpoint. In Ferguson, the riots that followed. In New York City, the protests and marches that followed the death of Mr. Garner in Staten Island. And everywhere, endless debate and discussion about a deepening racial divide in this city and this country. A divide that we thought had healed, naively, or that we had not recognized how deep those divides still were. Here in New York, that divide is deepest and widest in neighborhoods where disparity is deepest and widest, where the distance between the people and American dreams is the farthest, and they are the neighborhoods, ironically, where the police are needed the most. In New York City, they remain largely neighborhoods of color. And in them, the relationship with the police has sometimes been ruptured.
Joy, definitely recent events have provoked this speech now, but what I'm hearing in it is his 4 decades in law enforcement, an accumulation of protests that he heard in Boston, in New York, in Los Angeles, in every one of his duty stations.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the one thing that I think does separate what Commissioner Bratton had to say, and for instance what Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, had to say and why they're received so differently. He talked about the systemic problems that take place within low-income communities, and those being the precursor to the tensions between police and civilians. The issue, though, is Eric Holder experienced negative relationships with police when he was a prosecutor, getting out of a nice car and going to a movie. I think what a lot of officers don't understand is that perfectly legitimate and law-abiding black citizens and brown citizens encounter police in what should be non-threatening situations and are treated precisely the same way as if they were a suspect. And so if you have a community like Ferguson, which is a middle-class community, Ferguson was not in a challenged inner-city environment. This was a middle-class community where people get stopped every day so that the fees that are collected from ordinary law-abiding black citizens can fund the city. And I think that one of the things that police are going to have to get to, it's one thing to have an abstract conversation about history, and I commend Bill Bratton for doing that. It was brave. I think Comey was brave. But when Bill de Blasio talks about the lived experience of his own child, he gets the police officers turning their backs on him because how dare he talk about his actual lived experience. When we get to the point where police can accept the lived experiences of actual people of color and their parents talking about their experiences, then I think we'll have something.
Duran, when we come back, I want to get to what you think he got wrong or what you think you wish he had said. We're going to take a break. We're going to be right back.